a comment about.
So the talk that I'm giving tonight is, thank you all so much for coming, by the way. It's a beautiful evening. I kind of can't believe that you're all here. It's an act of comradely generosity just to be in the room on your part, and I'm grateful to you and grateful for it. The piece I'm going to present tonight is from a sort of a side project that emerged out of a kind of curiosity about service work, and particularly tip work, and particularly gig work and contemporary culture. So the title of this version is Gig Work, Sex Work, Tip Work, and Contemporary TV. Contemporary TV, especially short-form comedy TV, demonstrates a conspicuous interest in two related kinds of employment. Service work, which is namely waiting tables, bartending, hospitality, etc., and so-called gig work, temporary project-based freelancing. Over and over in recent TV shows including Crashing, Togetherness, Girls, Silicon Valley, High Maintenance, Master of None, Easy, The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Broad City, Search Party, and Atlanta, my hope is that even though I'm not showing clips, that you all will have seen one of these shows and will sort of have a general sense of what I'm talking about. We find references to contemporary gig work jobs, driving for Uber, working for TaskRabbit, renting your bedroom on Airbnb, as well as more historically familiar forms of service work, waiting tables, bartending, delivery. In some sense, this is no surprise. More and more people now work in some sector of the service economy, including the subsection of it known as the gig economy. The result of this shift has been what I term the tip workification of labor. In 1966, the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended to introduce the so-called sub-minimum wage for tip-based workers. Many of you probably know exactly what that is because you've had these kinds of jobs before. It's basically that you don't have to be paid regular minimum wage if a certain portion of your income comes from tips. The so-called tip credit provision, that's what it's called, the tip credit provision, essentially amounted to a massive government subsidy for the hospitality industry because they're not paying people living wages. They're not paying people anything close to minimum wage. The current tipped minimum wage is $2.13 compared to the standard minimum wage of $7.25, and it has been at exactly that rate for 27 fucking years. 27 years it's been the same. Moreover, the structuring conditions that define tip work in the service sector have been expanded by technologically mediated gig work. Also known as on-demand, flexible, or alternative work, gig work is now, in fact, the primary form of employment for 5 million people in the U.S. and is predicted to be so for 10 million people by 2021. Basically, every single new job created in the 10 years since the recession was gig work. Not all gig work is tipped-based, includes various jobs with a more traditional freelancing or piecework structure, but because it is non-contracted, the worker is typically paid directly rather than through a firm. The wage structure is also piecework or commission-based rather than time-based, and because of the reliance on a ratings model, a tip work structure defines work at TaskRabbit as much as work at Applebee's. So it's no surprise that more and more cultural narratives are curious about tip work and gig work. And yet I want to suggest that this interest poses somewhat of a dilemma for narrative. As other literary critics have observed, the transformation of an economy of landed property into an industrial economy and the transformation of the dominant literary mode from the courtly romance to the realist novel happened at around the same time. Capitalism in this period depended on credit, from new forms of credit money to new forms of consumer and industrial credit, and it depended on credibility, on the idea that you could judge the reliability of the stranger you might employ, or sell to, or buy or borrow from. The realist novel, with its demand that narratives be believable or credible, aided this transformation. Belief that you could read the character of characters on the basis of novelistic details like the appearance of a face or a mode of dress helped readers feel confident they could do the same thing in an increasingly dispersed market society. Capitalism in this period also depended, of course, on the contract, on the presumption of individual autonomy and formal equality, and our ability to imagine ourselves the kinds of consistent, free persons who could sign contracts, especially employment or wage contracts. In this, too, it resembled the realist novel, with its commitment to representing the stories of free protagonists who would remain consistent while they developed and matured. Even in its content, the realist novel was often about protagonist development into economic beings, narrating stories of education, vocational self-discovery, and rising, or occasionally falling, socioeconomic fortunes. As I've already begun to suggest, however, the wage contract is no longer a universally mediating form in an age of tip work. Our employment and professional lives no longer follow a straight line, and most workers no longer have a single contract with an employer, but instead must be infinitely flexible, thrown headlong into all different sorts of jobs under the eye of multiple temporary employers. As a result, I want to argue the tradition of realist character, the assumption that we follow a single line of vocational development, that we do the same job or even in some ways are the same person from day to day, hour to hour, that we are subject to the constraints and the protections of contracts, also no longer seem apt to describing the experience of unwaged service sector labor, where professional encounters are dispersed, multiple, and fragmented. In this talk, then, I want to think a little bit about the ways contemporary TV has to develop newly episodic, shifting, shorter forms to capture this experience, and to think about what TV's attempt to do so might reveal about the emerging politics of a tip work economy. Even though contemporary TV is decidedly interested in tip work and gig work, these kinds of employment often end up marginalized as soon as they are introduced. Often on contemporary TV, gig work is represented as a kind of side hustle the character endures while trying to make it big, often in some kind of cultural industry, stand-up comedy, writing, performing, etc. Of course, the very word gig, in the sense I mean it here, comes from cultural work. First used in the 16th century to describe a spinning top, like, thingamajig, comes from that whirligig, whirligig. To describe a spinning top. It didn't come to signify a kind of employment until the early 20th century, when it was used to describe the kind of one-night engagement that a musician might arrange, or a magician, mostly musicians. Thus, it's not surprising to find Pete, the would-be comic who is the protagonist of HBO's Crashing, working as a barker on the streets of New York trying to get customers into the club, or Ern, the would-be music producer of Atlanta, working an unwaged commission-dependent job at the beginning of season 1, or Odinaka, a repeat character in season 2 of Easy, who is trying to make it as a stand-up performer and driving for Uber on the side. One way to understand these shows' interest in gig work, then, is that it is merely a convenient metaphor for the kinds of freelance cultural work the writers and actors on the shows themselves do. However, I'm trying to suggest something different, namely that it is the cultural work that is actually the metaphorical overlay. Or, put otherwise, the narrative of cultural work, trying to make it big as an entertainer, solves a problem posed by the narrative of gig work, trying to make ends meet in precarious and uncertain employment. Namely, how do you make a spinning top the center of a narrative? If, as I have suggested, the gig worker is defined by multiple fragmented social relations and temporary, uncertain, and fluid working conditions, then her story is not easily wrestled into more familiar narratives of education, development, and achievement. The Bildungsroman of the up-and-coming cultural worker thus gives form to an otherwise formless experience. It is the cultural version of the ideological fiction that most gig workers gig as a side job, when in fact nearly 20% of the population now gets their primary income from gig work. So in the same way that we're told as a sort of justification for the way that the wages work with gig work, that like, oh, it's fine because people are just doing it as a side job, they actually have stable employment. I think that a similar thing is working out at the level of the narratives of these shows where it's like, oh, they're not really a gig worker, they're really a up-and-coming stand-up comedian. The problem of formless tip work is better solved, I think, by embracing it. That is, if wage work and the wage contract found their correlatives in the contractual, stable, credible form of the realist novel, then contemporary TV finds itself returning to and reinvigorating a narrative form that predates the realist novel, namely the picaresque. The picaresque is a narrative form first developed in 16th century Spain that would become the precursor of the traditional realist novel. It is a genre of fiction that is typically an episodic narrative of only partially connected events, depicting the adventures of a hero, or more often an anti-hero, typically from the lower classes, trying to make it by their wits. Familiar 18th and 19th century Anglophone examples would include Daniel Defoe's Moll Flanders, Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers, and Mark Twain's Adventures of Tom Sawyer. The picaresque protagonist, called the picaro or picara, depending if male or female, doesn't develop as the classical realist protagonists do. Described variously as protean, pragmatic, resilient, the picaro is, as one critic puts it, quote, not a character, but a situation. In what I term contemporary TV's tip work picaresque, the episodic, disconnected, plotless form of the picaresque is deployed to represent subjects whose working lives themselves are dispersed, multiple, and fragmented. A master of none, the picaro was often precariously employed under conditions outside his control. As one account of the picaresque has it, quote, whereas the fool is comical, the picaro never moves, but is moved. This differentiation between the comic fool and the passive picaro helps illuminate the flat affect that also permeates the tip-work picaresque. The literary critic C.N. Nye, in her marvelous book, Our Aesthetic Categories, argues that service work is most effectively represented by what she terms zany characters, whose manic energy indicates the indistinction between work and play, whose bodily distortions convey the demand that they be constantly flexible. Think Jim Carrey and the Cable Guy. That's her sort of central example of that kind of zany character that represents something about the affective experience of service work in her argument. But it seems to me that the contemporary tip-work picaresque focuses instead on a much more muted way of being in the world, a pragmatic and disconnected passivity necessary to endure tip work. Here, the best example is the guy in HBO's High Maintenance. The guy, a bicycle-riding weed deliverer whose appearance in the diverse apartments of New York City gives the show its semblance of narrative coherence, is a perfect example of the tip worker's stoner stoicism. So I actually kind of think that, like, whereas the character that Nye is describing is basically coked up, that the characters I'm describing are basically just like stoned all the time. As the non-protagonist of an essentially plotless narrative of events, his namelessness, he's always called the guy, indicates the way these picaresques refuse demands for conventional developmental characterization and opt instead for figures who are both everyman, the guy, yet also defined purely in relation to those they serve. I'm going to call the guy. Of course, if we recall one of the most well-known Anglophone picaresques, Defoe's Moll Flanders, we recall that the picaro was often a picara, and specifically a sex worker. And indeed, many of these shows draw on the connection between sex work and service work. The most obvious example of a direct connection occurs in HBO's Westworld, an hour-long drama set in a Western-themed amusement park entirely staffed by incredibly lifelike robots, where the customers can fulfill their wildest desires, roping cattle, shooting bad guys or good guys, and mostly having lots and lots of sex. Westworld is not at all a picaresque formally, but it is interested in sex work. The two central figures of season 1 are a sex worker robot, Maeve, and Dolores, who seems programmed to fulfill a more effective fantasy of chivalry and romance. The point of the show often is to suggest that in the end these two positions aren't really different. They are both forms of service. The show is most compelling as a drama of tip workification insofar as it can be read as thinking about the automation of service work. The original creator of the park's technology is named Ford, suggesting the show's interest in historical efforts to use technology to rationalize and ultimately displace labor. But also the show demonstrates an interest, I think, in what economists identify as the barriers to automating the service sector. As many recent studies of AI automation have suggested, the service sector is at the top in terms of technological feasibility for automation. As a McKinsey study notes, quote, 73% of the activities workers perform in food service and accommodations have the potential for automation. But this technological potential is undercut by the key feature of service work. It's cheap. That is, it doesn't make sense to replace a human or even 10 humans with an expensive robot if you're only paying the humans minimum or sub-minimum wage. This insight aside, however, in the end, Westworld fails as a drama about tip work precisely because it assumes a manifestly heteronormative male perspective, implying not that prostitution is degrading because it's a form of service work, but that service work is degrading because it's a form of female prostitution. Here, as in other recent shows, basically I think that this shows about the idea that there's nothing more abject than being fucked by a man, particularly if you're a woman, but not exclusively. Here, as in other recent shows, sex work is barely more than a metaphor, and more specifically, it serves as a way for a male character to describe the abjecting experience of their work. Thus, Pete in Crashing describes barking as being a low-grade prostitute, while a male customer, aptly named Johnny, taunts the guy in High Maintenance by saying, "What, you want me to leave the money on the counter like you're a hooker?" In these moments, the only non-abject subject position available is male, and more specifically, it is a position of a male viewer who wants to fuck but not be fucked. Unfortunately, a certain strain of male Marxist writing on contemporary labor seems to agree. Mark Fisher, in Suffering with a Smile, I love Mark Fisher, but this is a bad line, concludes by saying, "To understand work now, consider the pornographic practice of bukkake. Here, men ejaculate in women's faces, and the women are required to act as if they enjoy it, to lasciviously lick the semen from their lips." That's his metaphor for service work. While Carl Cederstrom and Peter Fleming's essay, "If Only I Could Be Fucked and Left Alone," imagines a male office worker who thinks, quote, I watched this documentary some time back. It perfectly summed up how my job makes use of me. It was about a brothel. I'm not saying these women loved what they were doing, but they seemed somehow resigned to lending their bodies to some unrefined truck driver who'd come in for a quick fuck. That's how my company squeezes the life out of me. Of course, in one sense, these comparisons of contemporary work to prostitution are incisive, allowing us to think about the feminization of work, whereby jobs and modes of organization, once specific to women's work, become dispersed across the economy. But they don't indicate the ways in which what Marxist feminist Maya Gonzalez terms, quote, the political economy of libidinal reproduction, operates with specific force on the bodies of those gendered as women, nor do they grapple with the possibility that service work and sex work are connected simply insofar as they are both forms of what sex work scholar Eileen Boris calls intimate labor. For an example of this insight, we might consider the aforementioned episode of Easy about the comedy writer making ends meet as an Uber driver, whose plotline runs parallel to a narrative about a writer who is also a professional sex worker. Here, prostitution is not a shameful and abject metaphor for service work, but simply a form of it. Where these shows succeed better is in imagining the forms of solidarity that bind tip workers and gig workers together. As the link to the criminal Picaro suggests, many of those who perform in-person service are not so far from the class Marx somewhat scornfully described as the lumpen proletariat, the, quote, relative surplus population, otherwise comprised of, quote, vagabonds, criminals, and prostitutes, and whose revolutionary capacities he largely dismissed. And yet I want to close by suggesting the possibility for a collective picaresque, and, as its corollary, a renewed commitment to theorizing the politics of subjects in a marginal relation to the wage. The wage implied a relatively clear and stable social relation, and thus a potential antagonism between bosses and employees. But the tip worker is likely to become the customer herself when she calls an Uber to get home from work, or stops and has a drink at the bar on her way there. Thus, although service workers clearly constitute a, quote, class in itself, that is to say, they're a product of historical conditions, and today at least, they're a product also of a change in the mode of production and a crisis in capitalism, they have not always been seen as a class for itself, that is to say, a potentially revolutionary social class. And it is indeed hard to organize service workers, and especially gig workers, into political forms like unions. The way that tip work and gig work are arranged and designed seems indeed to intentionally work around unionization, at least in its conventional form. Yet many of the contemporary representations of tip work on TV imagine the more horizontal, dispersed forms of sociality and indeed solidarity that tip work makes possible and that are themselves the basis for class consciousness. This kind of effective solidarity is central to high maintenance, where the guy often serves as a kind of gentle therapist for tip workers, getting them stoned after work. In an episode titled Trixie, wherein we meet a young couple who work in restaurants and bars and are making ends meet by being hosts in their own way, that is, they are renting a space in their apartment on Airbnb. Stressed out, they call the guy to deliver some weed and invite him to smoke with them while they all talk about their jobs. I'm never doing another service job again, ever, the guy says emphatically, only to correct himself and stoner trail off. Well, I guess I mean this is a service job, but... Indeed, although some episodes in season 2 frame the guy as an entrepreneur rather than a service worker, in material fact, after the partial decriminalization of weed in New York in 2013, most deliverers are shift workers who earn based on commissions and tips, and in fact, in some cases, they have actually been trying to unionize, but you can imagine how complicated that is. But the main action of the 5-minute episode, this is actually, by the way, High Maintenance has sort of like 2 incarnations. One was as a very short web series, and then it got bought by HBO, and now there's HBO episodes too. The web episodes, I think, are a bit better, so this is from the first season, which was the web episodes, and they're very short. The main action of the 5-minute episode is the woman in the couple narrating a story about her shitty waitress job, being bored at the end of a shift, and thus having an unusually extended and personal interaction with a customer who not only shafts her with 6% tip, but punctuates his exit from the restaurant by making a rudely abusive sexual gesture. Like that. Here, the show functions as a space simply to tell the stories of service work, to narrate the experiences of those on the margins of the employment market. Similarly, in a wild, but the episode ends with her stuffing all her tip cash in the pockets and shirts and pants of the male caterers and bartenders, giddily flipping the script on the gendered dimension of tip work. This idea of giving away becomes most revolutionary when it extends to characters giving away things they don't own. Paid via the sub-minimum wage, or without any employer at all, a tip worker or gig worker can't really commit wage theft, but she can steal stuff. We find some who would... Some attempt to imagine what this kind of theft might look like and what its conditions for possibility are in an episode of the Netflix comedy Master of None. As a whole, Master of None is a conventional Bildungsroman, roman, but Season 2's New York, I Love You departs entirely from the show's predominant plotline with its focus on Aziz Ansari's Dev. It begins instead with Dev and his friends discussing a movie they want to see, but quickly moves away from them and instead follows different characters who move abruptly from the scene's background into its foreground. In a way, this is really interesting. There's like a sort of account of the realist novel and its minor characters, and the way the minor characters of the realist novel are always these sort of shadow figures that are in the service industry, basically doing various forms of service work. And this episode seems to sort of make the minor characters the major characters for the episode. Blah, blah, blah. Eddie, a doorman, Maya, a bodega cashier, and Samuel, a taxi driver. The arc of the episode follows a kind of associative logic that rhymes with the protean restlessness of the Picaro. Dev passes Eddie on the street. We leave Eddie behind when he passes by Maya's bodega. Maya is second in line for Samuel's cab. And you can also see there the way that, like, one of the complications, as I said before, is that tip workers and service workers and gig workers often employ other tip workers and service workers and gig workers as part of their sort of daily experience. In the most powerful sequence about the relationship of these minor characters to the economy of the city and the economy of plot, Eddie is yelled at by a resident in the building who has brought a woman upstairs and wants Eddie to warn him if his wife is coming. When Eddie isn't able to do so, the man yells, "You have one job to do, one," to which Eddie replies, "Actually, sir, I have many different jobs for many different people." Eddie, in other words, is the master of none referred to by the series title, not only because he is jack of all trades, and not only because he is a master of no one, but also because his own masters are not one, but many. As the 17th century Spanish picaresque The Rogue described its non-protagonist, quote, "He is all the world, know him alone, and then ye know a multitude in one." For the Picaro, nothing is more constant than inconstancy, and yet in both his pragmatic struggle for survival and in his multiplicity, the Picaro represents a threat to the order of the social order, protean and canny, and also more and more typical. In the 1960s, the critic and organizer James Boggs wrote about the surplus people displaced by the automation of northern industry as outsiders on the margins of the wage war, who would not be captured by the already moribund industrial union, but who had only to realize, quote, "The means to live without having to work are all around them before their very eyes. The only question, the trick, is how to take them." Master of None's New York, I Love You, likewise, ends with a modest but remarkably powerful image of another kind of mutual aid among the marginally employed, as one of Samuel's friends, who works at a fast food restaurant, opens up the restaurant and gives free food to Samuel and a group of friends he is hanging out with. In the closed restaurant on a darkened street, they drink and dance on the tables. In these scenes of refusal and theft, we might see different possibilities for the Picaro's political roguery: theft, looting, seizure, and the trick. Thanks.
So this might be interesting because I have a really bad cold, but I think I feel like I can protect. Okay, so I had a little bit of a choose your own adventure, and I decided to do my more composed, specific thing on Apollos, and then I have some like more general framings that I'd like to give if I have time. So Chris is going to time me because I got a little overly ambitious. But when I start Apollos, I'm actually going to start by talking about for a second a different movie. Has anybody seen Starship Troopers before? Because I think it really exemplifies what I'm trying to say, which is that a lot of what I see in contemporary horror doing is being able to show how gender dynamics work, even when on the surface there's a kind of parity or equality, or when you have like Hillary running for president, or when there is a sort of superficial discourse of feminism. So I'll just show the clip and then I'll kind of explain a little bit more. Can you guys hear it at all? even if you can't totally hear it, you can hear the boosterism, you can see the militarism, the masculinity is on display, I think. They're very proud of themselves, they killed the bug, they got the bug. There's a lot of homosociality, fringing on other things. So that's the moment that I was going for. Maybe I can leave it on a still. But earlier in the film, you have like all the soldiers, they're men, they're women, they're all equal, they shower naked together, they don't harass each other, it's all beautiful. But then the bug is a big sexual vagina that gets penetrated by animals. So the feminized oppression is displaced onto this other that's not necessarily recognized as a cis woman. So that kind of comes up in the beginning of this. Okay, so now I'm just going to read this paper on this. Misogyny is a shapeshifter, a shadow, and it that follows and mutates to fit the culture's demands. It follows the gains in women's rights by limiting and individualizing them, discluding vast, objective, feminized populations from meaningful freedoms. The film Starship Troopers cannily sketches out a future world where women and men have achieved complete parity in social status and sexual relations. The only problem is that the context for this equality is a militaristic, fascistic society. In place of cis women, it is alien buds who are feminized and slaughtered mercilessly. To drive home the message that a sexually egalitarian world can be based on patriarchal logic, the enemy buds' faces are made to resemble vaginas. In case the viewer still doesn't get the joke, the sexualized violence that the film condemns becomes explicit in the final coda. Here, a scientist in a hazmat suit thrusts a probe into a bug's vaginal mouth, but the insertion is covered with black censorship. A takeaway message from this film, then, which actually a lot of people didn't get. A lot of people thought it was this really mean-spirited, militaristic film, but I kind of think the satire is pretty evident there. Verhoeven was like doing these small, kind of arty political films before he came to do blockbusters in the U.S. Is that without a historicized critique of social relations as a whole, the achievement of sexual equality alone cannot combat patriarchal violence. It, that is patriarchy, follows. An example of this problem from recent political history. In the same month that Malala Yousafzai was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for defense of girls' education in Pakistan, 13-year-old Pakistani Zubair-ur-Rahman testified in Washington about his experience in a U.S. drone strike that injured his sister and killed his grandmother. And there's a quote from this little boy who lost these women in his life. I just remember seeing an explosion and everything became dark, maybe because of the smoke from the drone. Later, I found out that my grandmother was blown to pieces and I felt like I was on fire. Malala's award was intended to communicate that the civilized global community supports the goals and dreams of women and girls subjected to patriarchal cultures. Yet, when one investigates the role of U.S. imperialism that contributed to gendered violence in Pakistan, the Nobel Peace Prize must be seen as a hollow symbol that can't begin to cover up a legacy of complicity. As Adonar Isami argues in his discussion of U.S.-Pakistani policy, the show of concern with human rights and democracy belies the fact that the U.S. has historically, consistently, and ruthlessly adhered to its own strategic interests in relation to Pakistan. Structural imperial violence and a Cold War legacy ties the U.S. to successive Pakistani dictatorships that have consistently deflected attempts at democratization and fostered austerity for Pakistani civilians. The social crises that arise in the wake of austerity, authoritarian dictatorships, and anti-democratic campaigns lead not only to the widespread drone strikes on innocent civilians, but to the misogynist violence Malala herself experienced. Nobel Peace Prize for one girl aside, the fundamentally patriarchal dynamics of geopolitical power machinations remain. It, that is gendered imperial domination, follows. Okay. It might seem simpler to understand how structural patriarchy works within the US, but it's not. The forms of neo-imperialism that structure global geopolitics also shape social relations within the US. The horror film It Follows helps us think about historicizing misogyny in relation to new capitalist logics. Here, enduring myths and fears surrounding women, adulthood, and sexuality are articulated to emergent logics of feminization in contemporary social forms. In the face of tectonic shifts in the logic of capital, It Follows recodes the well-worn generic trope of sexual panic and sexual disease to stand for a larger fear of futurelessness. Jay, the film's 19-year-old protagonist, lives in a suburb that looks like it was once solidly middle class, but is now run down and unkempt. The film follows her as she begins to date Q, who seems nice and normal enough despite some nervousness. They have consensual sex, but as soon as it's over, he chloroforms her, and she wakes up to find herself tied in a chair in a spookily regreened abandoned car park. There he informs her that she has contracted a sexual curse from him. She will be slowly and remorselessly followed by a shape-shifting, murderous entity who only she can see. It can be stopped only by passing the curse along sexually to another victim. As soon as that next victim is killed, it will resume stalking the previous person in line. On the surface, this plot seems to retread the hopelessly banal question of sexual promiscuity and threat. Critics see it as a film about teen confusion intended to, quote, explore what it is to be young. In the least subtle reading I came across, it was championed in the Catholic World Report as an admonitory message against promiscuity that could have been made by Pope Paul VI himself. Director David Robert Mitchell has stated that he had more than one thing in mind when making the film, and that he doesn't want to discount the many interpretations people have offered. However, he has admitted that he finds this anti-sex reading annoying, and that the sex in the film is meant to have hopeful dimension, something that is made clear in the framing of the sex scenes, where the mood is restrained, hovering carefully between tenderness and menace. The superficial symptomization of the anti-sex reading belies a more historically attuned register of the film. It Follows feels fresh and exciting because it does not dismiss a legacy of feminized abjection in horror film, but rather maps this layer of the film onto contemporary urban-based capitalist logics. Traditionally, this kind of film depicts a dread of the transition from innocence to knowledge. The post-lapsarian fall entails an understanding of the fundamentally unsatisfiable sexual and social desires of adulthood. It Follows historicizes the transitional period of adolescence by staging Jay's insertion into the social order according to the new logics of precarity. The fear here is not of motherhood or housewifery, as in the classic horror films Rosemary's Baby, The Brood, and The Stepford Wives, but of futurelessness, the new planet of slums in which productive and reproductive workers and spaces are no longer seen as integral to the reproduction of capital and are rather used up and cast out into the void. The sexual encounter that transmits it from Hugh to Jay is depicted ambiguously, filmed from a shadowy, neutral, distant point of view, allowing for multiple interpretations. Although Jay's innocently decorated bedroom and childlike features code her as virginal, we find out later that she is experienced and capable of thinking of sex as no big deal, puncturing the reading of this moment as one of sexual initiation. Afterwards, she lies on her stomach in the back seat of Hugh's car. This is her last moment before she finds out about it, and the only moment in the film where she is allowed introspection, uninterrupted by terror. Unaware that Hugh is preparing to knock her out and tie her up, she talks to herself, thoughtlessly, twisting a half-dead blade of grass. She says, "It's funny, I used to daydream about being old enough to go out on dates and drive around with my friends in their cars. I had this image of myself holding hands with a really cute guy, listening to the radio, driving on some pretty road up north, maybe. And the trees starting to change color. It was never about going anywhere anyway. It was just about some kind of freedom, I guess. Now that we're old enough, where the hell do we go?" Here, the wistful hope of adolescence is integrally entangled with death and stagnancy in the late capitalist city. Detroit, once a, quote, poster child of Fordist urban growth, and now a benchmark of urban shrinkage in an age of fiscal austerity, is the context for this horror. And that's a quote from Newman and Safransky. This sets up a parallel between gendered violence, in which women's bodies comprise a kind of sexual fix, and fiscal violence that demands a spatial fix, a theme also seen in the home invasion film reversal Don't Breathe, which features the obsolete white worker as both victim of the deindustrialized city and victimizer of women who he kidnaps and forcibly impregnates in his decaying Detroit home. It, the remorseless following monster, can be seen as the speculative spatial growth and capital accumulation that plunders an ever-widening terrain of life in the face of the shrinkage of resources and urban fragmentation that structures what David Harvey and others call subprime cities. I think there's an extra bottle of water. Okay. The formation of it as a chain, which can be passed down sexually, leads to a superficial reading of the film as an allegorical narrative of sexually transmitted disease. Oops. However, it can also be seen in light of what David Harvey refers to as the Ponzi character of asset markets that structure the neoliberal city, a chain effect in which, quote, one person invests in property and prices go up as another invests and so on. If and when overinvestment is either feared or becomes apparent, then the whole thing crashes. It is now difficult to see where for all the surplus liquidity can go and where it will find a profitable outlet for investment. In this way, the metaphor of the chain conveys a Ponzi form of being in the world, allowing for what Lauren Merlant calls cruel optimism, a hopefulness of the damned who are allowed temporary makeshift forms of survival, but who are never guaranteed reliable sources of social and economic stability, giving new heft and centrality to Marx's assertion and prediction, all that is solid melts into air. Spilling water. No matter how many times liquidity is invested, like it just was, in a new site, capital devours this solid host, leaving it a bloodless husk as it returns to its form of insatiable financial liquidity. The solid forms it takes only serve to taunt or misdirect the characters. It sometimes takes on the form of lost loved ones, but for Jay, it more frequently takes on the shape of nude women who look like they've seen better days. Jay is at various times pursued by aggressively nude older women. The most monstrous of them moves leadenly towards Jay while peeing herself, and as a punctum, we see she's wearing only one dirty athletic sock. These concretizations of it as a depleted, abused, degraded, and oversexed woman plays out the surface allegory of the film, fear of the transition to sexual knowledge and adulthood. However, this fear is intrinsically linked to poverty, and the appearance of these women, who are coded as homeless or prostitutes, parallels the spatiality of the film, which reviewer Charlie Line claims is structured around 8 Mile Road, a boundary that bisects the city into rich and poor sectors, quote, as a metaphor for another great divide, that between childhood and adulthood. This division between suburb and city, however, is something the characters mention with a kind of nostalgia, a fantasy that belongs to childhood. In the world of It Follows, this boundary has eroded, and the suburbs are seen to be in continuity with the ruin porn of the city. Detroit's desiccated streets echo the deserts and overgrown streets of the suburbs. Urban regreening and suburban degradation mark the symbiotic featurelessness of capitalist space. After Jay's gang realize that she is indeed being followed by a supernatural entity, they set out to find Hugh, who might have more information on how to fight it. This is the first time we see the city. The camera lingers on empty streets, burnt-out, abandoned, graffitied warehouses and homes, and overgrown shrubbery. They go to Hugh's, quote, house, which turns out to be a squat he'd been staying in order to pass along it, while remaining anonymous. The squat is notable for its similarity to Jay's house. It looks like a future vision of Jay and her friend's world, a large, filthy, empty husk of middle-class life. This continuity deflates the parental warning not to go south of 8 Mile. Parents and adults in general have little to offer the adolescents in the film and appear, if at all, as fragments and blurs. This adult impotence is foreshadowed in the opening scene of the film that shows the horrific end of a young woman who had clearly been stalked by it, past the point of endurance. We see her running in terror from her suburban home and deciding to drive to her doom, waiting on the beach for it. Her last act is to call her dad, who we earlier saw passingly and indistinctly, clueless as how to shield her from the unfathomable horror of her predator. In the last conversation, she reassures him that he was a loved protector and preps him for her death, showing the role reversal inherent in this brave new precarious world. This prelude sets the scene for the film as a whole. The adults in the film are largely absent and totally impotent. The only time an adult makes his or her presence known and agential is when it takes the shape of Jay's dead father, who violently and remorselessly throws domestic appliances at her while she treads water in an indoor pool, here recoding feminine liquidity as a respite from and target of male violence. It takes the place of the father, who is voided of any nurturing or protective impulses, similar to the paternal state, existing only to drain life. Jay and her sister Kelly's mother is alive but also absent. However, she is not figured as a symbol of callous or cruel adult world. Rather, she can't help her kids because she must work endlessly to keep up even the husk of a previous form of middle-class domesticity. At several points, the girls decide not to disturb or tell their mother about the horrors they are undergoing because it would only worry her. Quote, "She wakes up at 5:15. That would kill me," says Kelly, pointing to the mundane fears of the future that subtend the spectacle of it. Far from a symbol of cruel authority, the mother, who is shown only as a fragment or a blur, represents the teen's futurelessness, an absent presence of objected feminized labor, which no longer promises anything beyond minimal survival. The futureless future is one where even the right to basic maternal care work is forfeited. Unlike their mother, Jay and Kelly, along with their friends, do have time to band together to fight it. This gets at another side of the feminization of late capitalist subjectivity, pointing to the gendered logics of solidarity and what Nancy Fraser calls border struggles, as the young protagonists form a non-patriarchal unit of struggle, care, and mutual protection, whose liquidity and non-attachment is also a form of free time, in which to build alternate forms of sociality. The disappearance of industry necessitates a peak, quote, beyond Marx's hidden abode of production, as Fraser puts it, and a serious consideration of the background conditions for capital accumulation, such as feminized social reproduction. And these recent formation. This counters the discrete moralizing critiques of sexism that make neoliberal forms of feminist rhetoric complicit in structural subjection. And actually, I think that's all I'm going to do, because I can't speak anymore. I'm not used to these.
Yeah, good. Hi, my name is Ellie, Dicola, and I live and work here in Seattle. I'm a visual artist and a writer, and I am thinking about how to kind of approach like the topic of capitalist realism. I'm not so much an academic the way that this kind of thing manifests in my practice is much more through kind of the lived experience of the workday and the way that different intersections of experience kind of come together under an umbrella of capitalism. So I'm just gonna like read a little thing I wrote. It's really just kind of like a background of like how I got to this point and like the kind of work I'm doing now. And then I'm gonna show some work, both of my own and of just images and memes and work of other artists that I thought was relevant to this topic. So it's my little introduction. So I'm an artist. I work online with video, writing. My background is in sculpture. My day job is as an executive assistant for a woman that owns a small but very highly valuable collection of commercial properties here on Capitol Hill. I work about 3/4 time for her, and I do a ton of freelance work, design, arts writing, pet sitting, odd jobs, pretty much everything except like sex work and manual labor I've done. So I've lived in Seattle for the better part of 15 years, and I think that like my whole like relationship with labor is pretty typical of people in like a millennial and what was once thought of as Gen Y, like right before the millennial, not quite Gen X, not quite millennial, which is where I fit in. But I grew up joined the workforce in the early 2000s, around 9/11, and at that time, it was very kind of thought of as a given right that you would have a job, you would pay your bills, pay your rent, and then have the rest of your life to kind of do your thing. And so that's what the situation was when I joined the workforce. I mean, of course, of course, capitalism is really problematic, but this shit really kind of hit the fan around 2008, 2009 when everything crashed. I lost my job. I had been working full-time as an administrative assistant. My unemployment benefits were about $300 a week, so that was $1,200 a month. I had to choose between paying my rent and buying food or paying off my student loans and my credit card debt, so that went out the window. I went into a deep financial hole. I got sued in a civil court case. A decade later, basically, I'm just now climbing out of that hole. So from that point forward, as Annie was talking about with gig-based work, everything shifted from like you have your job and whatnot, and you count on that, to round of temp work, working with staffing agencies, so on and so forth. Nothing ever stable, nothing ever lasting really for more than a summer. No health insurance, and this was all before the Affordable Care Act. So there really was no health insurance, and this is where kind of gets into the things that I'm exploring in my work. I have, due to some specific like early childhood experiences, like a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic illness, what the psychology community refers to as somatic illness, which is like physical manifestation of trauma. So a lot of my work also kind of considers that and how the emotional labor in presenting and performing competence in the workforce, in relationships, really obviously impacts your health, but then that the healthcare industry doesn't really recognize mental health as being like the same or as critical as physical health. So often you don't have the health benefits that you need, and so on. Stop there and get into the work. This is a multimedia, like an 8-page web project that I made last summer. Just look through it. It takes a little while. For whatever reason, the back end of this website is, where it's hosted is really slow, so it's a little while to load. So this first page is called the Hot Crazy Matrix. How do I get the audio on?
Well, this is probably it. It goes down or up.
Okay.
So.
Huh. Well, there is audio. I don't know.
See that.
Don't know why it's not
How about,
on here.
yeah, is there something else? How about over on the left side? You see on the video on the left, the far left, there's a little megaphone with the third from the left.
Oh, this right here? I don't know. Anyway, this is a video that I adapted. Like, this white middle-aged lawyer created a video called the Hot Crazy Matrix that went viral on YouTube, that kind of is meant, like, unironically to serve as a guideline for men on like evaluating women, like the hotter a woman is, the crazier she is, and kind of, yeah, it's really disgusting, but also really funny. So I really wish that the audio worked, but I adapted that video and have like.
This, hit this over here and see if it, oh, is that the, that's just a.
This is just a gift.
Well.
I don't know, it worked on the other thing. Anyway, so this is called Crazy for You, and it's basically like a collage of headlines about how both crazy and femaleness are represented in the media. It explores that the dynamic of a woman with asserting demands for respect or responding to lack of it, how that is branded back onto the woman as, well, you're crazy, or, I don't know. Oh, there we go. Huh. That I just passed this actually really directly speaks to that intersection of these themes with consideration of capitalism. Like the gist of what I've been trying to get at. Not well enough to sustain yourself within capitalism, but not ill enough to qualify for disability. The lost days when you can't get out of bed, but feel like you're lying when you say you're sick, or have to call into work because bipolar triggered by intense sun kept you up till 5 a.m. And then the fear you'll lose your job. Capitalism's requisite that you be well enough to serve at all times, but ill enough to buy in, not truly well. And if you manifest its own distress in any way other than buying in, you're cut. Crying in the bathroom on your break at work, when coming out 5 minutes later and showering the public with charm and smiles, and being aware of such a vast disconnect between the self you're paid to perform and the authentic experience. Also that the labor you're being paid to do is actually you reassuring capitalism itself that it is well, reflecting this shared need to believe that we're okay because we're collectively afraid of death. And so then there just are all these like little, these are actually taken from an actual like employer's motivation manual, like these little slogans and stuff. So this is this forced optimism or kind of idea of cruel optimism, I guess. And then just text excerpts from conversations with friends. The final page is just basically just an essay. So yeah, that's kind of how this stuff manifests in my work. And I have a little slideshow as well. It'll be coming. Okay, I don't know what's happening. PowerPoint crash. So, do you know anything about getting this?
Crash.
Well, just getting this to read, the projector to read what's on the screen.
Yeah, is there a tech person in the house? I love the idea that capitalism needs your assurance that it is well.
Yeah.
So
It's
weird.
a wonderful
Yeah.
phrase. I just
Now
posted it
it's-
on
Oh, really?
Yes, but
Yeah.
boy.
It's really true.
I
I've
think
done
so.
it all. In terms of like the crappy jobs and, you know, part of
This
it.
is all best wishes. Please
Well,
return
and then,
all
oh,
proxies, and please always remember that the real minimum wage is 0.
I can't get it pulled
This is
up,
great
though.
stuff. This is
I know, but
true.
nobody can see it.
Well, they can imagine.
Philip will narrate it to us.
Take the words. They seem some of it. Yeah, what's it? God,
I don't know.
what the capitalism? You're not working.
It's really frustrating.
12,000 hours. Tech.
Oh, there it
It's
is.
over there.
Almost.
Move it over.
Yeah. You just have to pull it.
Yeah.
Pull it.
You can do it.
It's
Yay!
so weird because I can't.
Woo!
I can't see it.
I can't see it to operate it, so I don't know what happened. But I will try to navigate it this way.
Maybe just the down
Just,
Get off the ground.
button.
ooh, ooh. Well,
Yes,
this person looks competent.
good.
Core competencies. I know the words, but I have none. Carbonize your display, or customize your display.
Okay, so okay, so last summer, when I was working at a major arts institution, I was a tour guide and like admissions representative for a blockbuster show. We probably had about 25 people coming through on a daily basis, and about 3/4 of the way through, from like working, I think I worked like 6-day weeks usually. I have mild scoliosis and I really can't be like on my feet standing in one place. It's fine to be moving around, but standing in one place all the time, my back started giving out. And so I started speaking to my employers about, like, can you put me somewhere else? Put me at the desk, put me where I'm moving around, just not like standing here giving these speeches like all day in one place. And they kind of blew it off until I brought in a doctor's note about it, and then I got my way. But I got an email a few days after the show ended not from my manager, but from the HR department, saying, we understand that September 10th was your last day. We're going to need you to return your badge, your passwords, everything. Best wishes. With no explanation, even though I requested feedback. So I made a project about that experience called Notch Void and Cashing Out that actually remixes text from the employee manual and handbook from that job to explore transactional dynamics. I mainly like drew from language that related to cash handling and that kind of thing, since that was part of my job. And remixed it to kind of draw relationships between personal or professional relationships and like monetary transactions or understandings of value. So this is in installed form. And then these are the actual poems, nothing personal. At first I might seem uninvested or at worst benign, but I keep all voids, returns, and receipts in my personnel file, separate from my credit transactions, counting all discrepancies. And when your total doesn't match my total, I recount everything, and if the error remains, I call it, and if the error remains, I use my street credit. I do not input transactions into the register if the receipt tape has run out. I replace receipt tape before inputting transactions. I keep one foot on the pedal and one foot on the brake, just like you asked me. I know protocol is never personal and professionalism is never emotional. So we don't owe each other anything. Everything's mutually at will. No hurt feelings, okay? So there are 3 of these poems. I won't read all of them. And then I got into these documenting flower arrangements in corporate spaces. So the rest is just, this is actually from the site of that job. And making memes, like how the admissions team got through the day of this nightmare job, making memes, making fun of the whole thing. This is downtown Seattle. This is just from Instagram. Good things come to those who hustle, which we know kind of isn't actually completely true. And then I don't know, I'm really into like something that I think of as the aesthetics of anxiety, which is just this precarious, like things aren't okay, but an embrace of that, I guess. I'm dead too, but for right now I'm doing pretty good. Kind of like almost healthy is the new healthy. And then Tide Pods. This is something that like super young kids are getting into, this challenge of eating Tide Pods. I don't know who's familiar with that meme, but it does kind of speak to this idea of like the only answer, like the only way to opt out is to consume poison and kill yourself, which I'm not recommending we do. I'm not like that nihilistic, but I am interested in how that sort of aesthetic speaks to the reality that we're in. This was a project locally at a Seattle called the Alice, a gallery called the Alice in Seattle. This is more stuff that I made. Images from a recent Gucci fashion walk. That this kind of sick strangeness or embrace that like things aren't okay. This is a kind of a nod to Black Mirror, which if you haven't watched it, you should watch it on Netflix, because themes are really relevant to this whole topic. Still images. Basically, this episode is about a reality in which everything is everybody's worth and therefore opportunities are like based off of their ratings, and you get rated for everything, like your interaction, buying a coffee, and basically this woman's rating took a nosedive and ruined her life, but she kind of came out of it with a more realistic, authentic understanding of herself. So more Black Mirror. artist named Amalia Ullman, who makes a lot of Instagram and internet-based work about labor and disability and sickness, chronic sickness. Audrey Wallen. A local artist named Alex Kang. The BECU lobby. And just wanted to touch on that also kind of the idea like aesthetics of self-care. That like self-care itself has become this like industry in this economy because we're also lacking in care, and it's like the way that we can envision care is through an industry of self-care rather than actual care. And then the final image is from a TED show. Okay, so.
I think we're meeting you at the Blockbuster exhibit. We think we talked as I went through it.
I'm kind of outing them completely in front of a room full of people.
It was very strange. You could only go 4 people at a time for 15 seconds to see each thing in it. But that's the one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The Kusama show.
And it's a case where it was like you were on the assembly line as a product.
Mm-hmm.
And though you knew obscurely that the artist was very good and you would be interested under other circumstances, this is the exact opposite of flaneuring. You're a product on an assembly line that takes a quick glimpse of something that doesn't register, and you're on to the next thing where you're 4 seconds. You know, you're thinking, why go to all this trouble to do this? You know, but anyway, I mean, we know why, but you know, anyway.
Yeah.
But I remember running into you in the midst of that, and you were like the one thing in there that I sort of recognized from real life. Anyway.
Well, in theory, it's my job to mediate some questions, and I'd be happy to do that. But the presentations were also innately interesting, and I imagine lots of people in the room just have questions they would like to ask. So, if you're all comfortable, you could, answer questions from folks raising their hand. I'm trying to help if need be, but.
So what I found really interesting was earlier there was a talk about this TV show where like gig economy workers are seen as like manic or like they're scattered, they can do anything. So it was really interesting tying that to your experience. I think a lot of us have gone through the experience too. I don't think people really identify this. Like there's no cohesive aesthetics or even conversation about the economy. So when people think of like mental illness or self-help or this, these are all like individual atomized little issues as opposed to seeing it how it's like this emerging sort of set of characteristics we're coming. So my question was, are there any plans to actually really like attack that topic more and how to explore that or how to like talk about it to people? Because I think one of the issues is identifying. Like a lot of people don't really identify it as one related thing, and it's related to their work issue and their economic situation.
I mean, I think like these shows are interesting, but I actually think your work is much more interesting than these shows. And I'm a fan of the shows. So I mean, I think that in a way, the funny thing for me is that it's happening in this sort of like marginally in pop culture in ways that it's not happening yet as part of like a sort of conversation, except among people like with their friends at the bar, basically. I mean, that's sort of my sense. But certainly like that problem of like sort of collectivizing the experience is also why it's like fucking hard to organize, like really hard, right? Because it just doesn't work that way. That work experience doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I think it's also really important to like normalize conversations about mental health. It's still so heavily stigmatized, much more than other like forms of intersectional experience or diverse experience. So I think that like similar to what's happened with the Me Too movement and other like movements of people kind of breaking silence. I think that for there to really be any change in the workforce, there has to be like a much broader normalization of where people are even able to have that conversation in the first place.
I mean, I think this is the beginnings of a kind of clearer conversation about maybe something's generically identifiable, like maybe there's a genre, you know? You were making me think. Yeah, well, sure. Of the queer theorist and literary critic Anne Svatkovich, who has written about the politics of depression and has been talking about that a lot lately. That could be end up being a piece of this conversation too.
I feel like my students, and all the students I teach, I mean, I don't know if this is your experience too, Joe, but I feel like the students that I teach, like that they're the way that they talk about this stuff and their willingness to talk both about their futurelessness, their not upward or downward mobility, and also their depression it's really changed a lot, I think, in the last 2 years. That's my sense too. Can you bring it to me?
Just as an anecdotal thing, Marie Bamford is pretty interesting on that, but I don't think she has her work. Oh, you should check her out. She's a comedian, but she doesn't, I don't think she's fully able to connect it to gig work, but it's kind of implied in her work in a way that I'm interested in. Yeah. But she's very vocal. That's her project as a comedian, is to like not stigmatize mental health.
It does seem that there's no connection in the conversation as it appears when it really does in the media between essentially the cancellation of the future and the effects on the body. You know, to have any kind of real conversation, one would have to come to the various source that the body knows that essentially it's going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, I think that's sort of interesting. I didn't think about that, but with It Follows, it's about like coming into your sexuality, which is supposed to be glorious and terrible, and it's kind of neither. It's just like, I'm just going to have no future at all, right? There's nothing really, it's not a very physical movie, like the sex is kind of neutral and restrained, and it's more about this just like landscape where the sort of feeling registers and in the music and things like that.
Yeah, one of the things I read about like is my sense that like contemporary, like that you know, people, millennials basically, that Berlant idea of cruel optimism that Joe cited, like there's no optimism anymore, right? And I think that's where you get that sense of like, for me, it's something between like depression and stoicism.
Yeah.
Like something between a kind of like a sort of I keep wanting to say political passivity, and that sounds exactly wrong because I don't mean that they're politically passive. I mean that their politics lies in passivity. But that's the affective tenor of it, rather than like mania, which is sort of the way that this often is described, I think. And you know, like to talk like what you were sort of suggesting.
A couple of things. I want to let people in the room know that there is an effort afoot to organize gig workers in Washington. It's being done by Working Washington. So it's not like revolution or even direct action. It's sort of legislative in focus, but trying to get portable benefits so that it's disconnect between the laws about work and how work is actually done. Like, you know, you work at less than minimum wage, and minimum wage laws don't affect gig workers. If you're local to Washington, Working Washington is worth checking out for their gig worker project. Then also, I was really interested in the cuteness in the last work, and it was making me think that Paulo Virno worked on collective moods, and he says that cheerful resignation is the primary mood of workers today. And I think I saw that or I don't know, actually I'm just curious about the cuteness of it, like whether you see it as resistant or compliant And then one last thing, not let you answer, it's also, I was really interested in the I statements of that employee manual, like I do this, I balance the transactions. Was that from the employee manual, or did you recast it as I?
No, I recasted it.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
That's it, I scattered. but-
it was sort of a, I don't know, I conceived of that project as an exit interview in a way. So I recast it as I think sort of, I don't know, like as a strategy to reflect back to them. Like as if that HR person were aesthetic, kind of more of a feminist. I guess it started for me more as a feminist concern than like a employment or capitalist realism or whatever. But I don't really believe in a separation between these. I mean, I kind of don't even make a distinction between capitalism and patriarchy. So.
I wonder if it's possible to imagine a kind of collective passivity, collective passive bartleby politics of we would prefer not to or something. I mean, how would one get to that where it would be, everybody would be withdrawing at the same time?
I just had a, oh, sorry, what is there? I was wondering, are you sort of made in presentations, so many connections that you know, talk about, I was thinking about poetry a little bit, you know, those beautiful calligraphic shaped poems at the end of your presentation. I really wanted to be able to spend time with them. I was also thinking about this poet, Kevin Lees, who hasn't published in a long time, probably because he's frequently, I think, depressed. And he's a little bit of that drilling that you're describing, but he has an amazing book called The Golden Age of Paraphernalia, 28 or 29. And the line in it that just says, I can't work today because I'm crazy. I was thinking about, there's something special and genius about Kevin's poetry, where there's a kind of like, it takes you a long time reading it, maybe over his career, to see that there's like a kind of, the review I just went back to, it was like a comedy club of the day, but this kind of like zen sense of like coming to consciousness and being like, whoa, wait, this is the material world? What? And being like shocked by like the finishes on objects and the arrangement of space and the way people look at each other. It's like radical innocent impression of self that like allows you to see the horror. So I was thinking about horror a little bit, but also I was thinking about gender, you know, and how like so much of the pressure and distortion of violence is placed on the gendered arcs in the bodies of women, and it makes me wonder like what besides like neo-Nazi resentment, outrage expresses itself in this landscape among men. And there aren't that many options that I can think of, you know. I mean, certainly the checked outness of the guy, you know, stonerdom, I guess, is one. Like if we were to be Sienna and start to try to make a catalog on a whiteboard of like the ways that differently gendered people comport themselves.
Playing
what would
video
that catalog
games in your parents' basement, I think, is the male.
What's that?
Playing video games in your parents' basement, right? Failure to launch, male failure to launch.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like only a couple male figures that are really it follows, and they really follow that line. Like one's the nerd who plays videos in his basement, and the other's the cool guy who's like has all this bravado, and who takes on the curse because he wants to get laid or something and gets killed immediately.
Taking into consideration the title of the talk, and you've made sort of like passing references to Mark Fisher. I'm curious about what you take from Mark Fisher and the limitations. I've assigned his capitalist realism in my own classes, and had my own kind of problems with the reception, leading to nihilism, kind of not really having the intended effect. What has been your experience with that, if any?
I like teaching it, I guess partly because sometimes I think it works to find something that goes with the student's mood rather than against it, but I totally know, I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about. I know exactly that experience. And I don't always find his descriptions of, I think that there's some troubling gender stuff in his descriptions of work, as in the bits that I quoted. But I have mostly found teaching it pretty successful, especially, I mean, I try to pair him with like more manifesto-y type stuff when I can, so that sometimes helps a little bit. But I totally feel what you're talking about.
Maybe I'm framing it with suicide.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's hard. I mean, I haven't taught him since then. I will say that. Yeah, I taught him like 4 years ago. Was the last time.
Yeah, I haven't taught him. I found it very therapeutic for myself, just to think about, politicize your own mood stuff, but I teach in such a down and out place that I find that my students respond to more direct things about oppression because they're not at the stage of enemy, like their dad's in jail, their mom's, kicking them out of the house, so it's just like that kind of cool disdain. They're not quite at that space yet,
That's a really important distinction.
Yeah, I'm really curious about like the difference between different student populations within the same generation, and to what extent they experiencing thwarted upward mobility or never had an expectation of upward mobility, right? Like what was their parents' trajectory, and to what extent have they ever expected to follow that trajectory or not, right?
Yeah.
And then the question of whether or not like what they're doing as students, for instance, is like survival or achievement. And I think even within the same generation, I think you have a general sense that nobody is exactly going up, but the difference between the kids who really think they're going down and the kids who just assume like, okay, we were never going anywhere to begin with, is like, it's an interesting difference.
Well,
Even moving from I used to teach in Wisconsin, and then I moved to California, and the difference between teaching in Milwaukee and teaching in Southern California, even though they're both public institutions and they're like a sort of superficially similar-ish student body, has been wildly different.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of goal is to not make people feel like they blame themselves
That's right,
for not making it, because that's what they're nailed in, the bootstrapsism and it's just the message over and over. So, because, their parents didn't, so and they think they should make up for that somehow.
Well, I think this has been terrific, and I want to thank everybody very much for doing this. And I want to thank the audience for clearly being totally absorbed in everything that was happening as I look out in the audience and watch. And let's give everybody